Welcome to Chapter 1 of the Cruise Planning class. This class is preparation for our BVI Flotilla. Each week we'll have a video conference call to go over the review questions at the end of the chapter and cover other related BVI material. Let's get started. The primary audience for this class is really narrowed into the beginning cruiser, let's say. We're talking about the recreational boater, not someone that's going to cross the Atlantic or anything like that. We're looking at cruises of planning for 1 to 4 weeks in duration, maybe an inland cruise or along the coast, and it's really trying to help us build a good plan for our cruise. The book is divided up into 3 parts. The chapters 1 to 13 are the actual detail information for us to consider as we're planning our cruise. The second part is some cruising examples that we might want to consider for a study. There's the Atlantic Intercoastal Waterway Cruise, an Inland Waters Rivers Cruise, the Pacific Northwest Cruise, and also the Great Lakes. And finally, the way to make this really make sense is to plan an exercise. For us, what we're going to do is we're going to actually use our BVI Flotilla plan as our exercise. Here are the topics that we're going to be covering in this chapter. Our planning for a cruise, the location, collection of information about our cruise, considerations for season and length of time, some planning factors, and then alternative cruising options. The first step in planning a cruise of any length is the choice of a destination. We might consider going from Miami to the Bahamas, starting in a specific city and trying to get to a destination. Or we might just plan to go across the bay or something like that as our program. We could go anywhere along the way. We can look at sailing on a river or a specific state. Like for example, we might want to go up to the Door County and work in that, sail around there. Or maybe our plan is say, okay, well let's go to Belize and sail there. As we're planning for our cruise, we need to look for additional information in various sources so that we can really know what we're getting into before we get there. There are a lot of different sources of information. One of the key ones that I like to use and rely upon heavily are the cruising guides for the area. Since we're using the moorings, they created a BVI e-guide at this link, moorings.com cruising-guides, and you'll have to link down into it a little bit deeper to look at the e-guide for the BVIs. They also have other e-guides for other locations that we might want to consider for a future flotilla. In this e-guide, there are lots of information that helps us know what to do or how to respond or what to expect when we get to the road town, which is in the BVIs. It has information about the marina, our on-arrival check-in procedures, what you can do while you're waiting for your boat to get ready, some provisioning information, restaurants in the area. It also has information about when you want to bring your boat back, which will be a sad day because that's the end of our cruise. There will also be other information about non-sailing activities, some cruising area information, emergency contacts, and then it also has some suggested itineraries that we'll be working on in the future. Our plan is to actually, since we have 7 days, we're going to create a 7-day itinerary. In addition to that, there's also cruising guides, a cruising guide for the whole British Virgin Islands. And that's the second link. This cruising guide is about 500 pages in its wealth of information. I would recommend that you order one of these from the internet or from the moorings. Be sure and get the 19th edition because that's the cruising guide that has information after the hurricane. cruising guides before that have a lot of information about places that are not open yet because of damage done by the hurricane 2 years ago. And so you'll want to look for that information. This cruising guide has information on each one of our harbors, as well as all kinds of information about the location. For example, each harbor, if there's fuel, laundry service, what restaurants available, grocery stores, sites to see. It'll also give us a map or chart of the harbors as we get in, showing you how to approach the harbor if there's any obstructions and things like that that we have to avoid. And so it's really the guide that I look to whenever we're going into a new harbor. The next area for information are magazine articles. Now, since I've been quarantined for the last couple of weeks, I'm getting a chance to look over my Cruising World magazines in a lot more depth. And this is where we can look at not only information about the British Virgin Islands, but it also has information about other cruising opportunities, experiences for people that have gone cruising and things like that. So magazine, Cruising World, and other things like that are really a good example. In addition, you'll also need to have a chart of the areas we're going to be cruising. So in the U.S. water, the NOAA creates charts for the United States. If you go into foreign areas, they'll do the chart. They'll publish charts with the National Geospatial Agency, and then in even more detailed information, NOAA also publishes the Coast Pilot information. So these charts you would refer to as you're studying and planning for your route to the various harbors as you go through. In addition to that, there are also cruising clubs that provide information about various locations to charter. These cruising clubs, some of them even create rallies. For example, there's a rally that gathers people together to do an Atlantic crossing, if that's something that we would want to do. And finally, the U.S. Power Squadron also has port captains in many of the ports that you can refer to, call them or contact them for information about a specific harbor, things to do if you have questions about procedures for getting in and things like that. In addition to the paper material, we also have online research. Many of you have already been searching out the internet for information. And there we can go to various web places, blogs for cruisers that have done things. There are lots of blogs out there. In fact, we can probably even refer to our very own Trent and Heather Johnson, who have been cruising around the Bahamas for information. There's also information about the marinas and things like that. You can also look for official travel information from the travel office at a city, or a Department of State for foreign travel, and embassies for locations in other countries. And the next thing we need to consider is, when are we going to cruise? Okay, for example, we probably don't want to cruise Lake Superior in December, because it might be a little harder to get our boats out of the harbor. In addition to that, we need to look at, okay, what is the particular season? In the wintertime, all the northern areas are just not really practical for our sailing. But the winter is an excellent time to go to the Caribbean, because it's so much nicer than what we would experience here in Illinois. In the summertime, there's a lot wider area because everything is, warm and thawed out. But we also have to consider the hurricane season, which is generally from about June to November for hurricane. And so we need to plan for those, or make sure that we're not going to get caught in one of those bad situations. In addition to the season and time, we can also look at the timetable how long can we go on this cruise? Most of the working people have a limited amount of vacation, so they have to fit that into their, okay, if we've got a week's vacation, we're going to do our cruise for a week. And when is my vacation available? We're planning our trip so that it lines up with the spring break at the U of I, and so we've got that window of time for us to go on our cruise. In addition, how long you can sail is also, determined by the time and place that you're going to go um, and cross. The next thing we need to consider is how far can we go each day. So, for example, if we're looking at how fast is your boat, now on these cabin boats, we're talking about they're probably doing a 5 to 6, maybe 8 knots tops for their top speed. And so when we're planning our time, our speed, 60D Street type calculations, then we will use, we probably should plan for using a 70% of our normal cruising speed. So for example, when I'm planning for our BVI trip, the boat's probably do 7 or 8, but if it gets down, when I'm looking at the knot meter, if it gets down below 4 knots, I'm probably thinking about augmenting the speed with sail power with a little bit of iron jenny. Turn the engine on, give me a little extra push so that we can continue to maintain our a minimum of 4 knots, let's say. It's boring to sit out there and bob and bake. I do a lot of bob and baking on Clinton Lake, and that's not something I want to do down in the Caribbean. We also need to consider that we wanted to probably time it so that we got 4 or 5 hour travel time. So make our destinations so they're within that window. Most of our trips are going to be under 5 hours as we go from one island to the next. But, so we've planned that in so that if the weather's bad or we want to take a break and maybe stop along the way and see some sites like go snorkeling or stop in at the baths or things like that, we've got the time to do that within our cruise for the day. The weather is also a factor that we need to also consider. One of the things we haven't done in the past is allowed for exceptions for when the weather doesn't cooperate. One year we had planned to go up the Sir Francis Drake Channel all the way to the North Sound, but that day the wind was just howling straight down the channel, and so we were going straight into the wind, big heavy chop, and so we made an alternative plan to go over to one of the other islands that wasn't quite so far, and we could then seek some shelter in the shadow of those islands as we made our way up to our next destination. We need to always pay attention to what the weather is going to do so that we can keep track of that. In addition to that, we need to also look at when having a float plan and have that information available to someone that you trust in case you run into trouble or don't get there. This is something that we would want to do, especially on local areas. One of the things that I encourage my son, he likes to kayak up on Lake Evergreen by himself. Now that's a little bit dangerous, but whenever, I ask him that whenever he goes up there to tell us when he's going on the water and how long is he planning to be there, send us a text or something, and then when he gets back, tell us that he's made it back successfully. That way, if he has a problem somewhere out on Lake Evergreen and he's not back in that time frame, we could go check on him and see what happened. In addition, we want to pay attention to what the medical requirements are and make sure that we've got enough medication to last for the duration of our trip. And then also, one of the things that we'll also do is plan for the crew who's going to be able to come along and sail with you to man the boat when you're on the way. So far, we've talked a little bit about cruising, in a specific destination for a limited, or a period of time. There's also some other options that people might do for a cruise and planning for that cruise. And what we're talking about here is that perhaps I know some people have wanted to move their boat from the Chesapeake down to the Caribbean for the winter. And so one option, that takes probably several weeks to make that trip. And so what they've done is they've actually broken it down so that they move it a little bit at a time. So they would start at the Chesapeake and then they'd sail for 2 or 3 days down to the next harbor and then drop the boat off in a marina, close it up, come back home, do some work, earn some money, spend some time at home, and then come back down and head to the boat for the next leg of their journey. And they could do this in many bites at a time to see how, to get that done. And that way you can, kind of fit it in with your work schedule, your family schedule, and things like that. In addition to having, moving that, we've already talked a lot about big boat cruising. Well, we've got smaller boats here in our area so that we can look at other options for getting getting the boat around to where we want it to be. I remember when Gary moved his boat from Michigan over to Lake Superior, he was cruising for several weeks to get the boat through all the locks and through Lake Superior, down Lake Michigan, all the way up to Lake Superior. It took him several weeks to do that. With our boats, we can take and put them, they were on a trailer. So what we can do is we can put them on a trailer and we can move them from Clinton Lake, take them up to Green Bay, sail for a week, bring them back home. If we want to go to Lake Erie, we can put them on a trailer, haul them up to Lake Erie, sail up there for a while, come back home, and move them around. In addition, we can also have larger boats. You can have them trucked. I know that some competitive sailors that wanted to sail from here in the U.S. and take their one design boats over to a regatta in Europe or Japan. They actually load them into a container, ship the container over there, and then unpack them when they get to sail the regatta, and then ship them back home. This concludes Chapter 1, Cruise Planning for our British Virgin Island Flotilla. Please let us know if you have any comments or questions.